Margaret Beaufort rose above her station and became the architect behind the notorious Tudor Dynasty. She was an expert at puppeteering those around her to bend to her will, but that's not all she did. Modern historians have suggested that Beaufort might have been behind one of the most heinous and mysterious crimes of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret Beaufort's father, John, was a prominent general who helped the English lead campaigns against the French. He died in 1444, just a year after Margaret was born. She never knew her father, but she did inherit his sizable estate, making her one of the most eligible brides at court, even though she was still just a child. Her father had asked King Henry VI to make Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, her sole guardian, but the king had other ideas. He passed Margaret's wardship to one of his favourites, William de la Pole, 1st Duke of Suffolk, who quickly formulated his own plans for the young heiress. You see, there was something they all knew about Margaret Beaufort, something that she was too young to comprehend. She had a tenuous connection to the English throne. If you trace her lineage back, her branch of the family had been the result of an illicit affair between King Edward III's son, John of Gaunt, and a mistress. For the Duke of Suffolk, Margaret was his ace in the hole, and he was ready to deploy her at just the right time. Unfortunately for him, the English were on a downward trend when it came to losing territory to the French, and someone had to take the blame. It ended up being him, and he faced banishment. In a panic to ensure his son's future, he married the boy, John de la Pole, to his ward, Margaret Beaufort. The bride was maybe 7 years old, and the groom not much older. The exiled Duke of Suffolk set sail away from England, only for sailors to nearly immediately capture and behead him. Once again, Margaret was adrift. She was still under the care of her mother, but her wardship, along with that of John, fell once again to King Henry VI. In 1453, the king transferred Margaret's wardship to his two half-brothers, Jasper and Edmund Tudor. Next, he dissolved her marriage to John de la Pole, leaving the boy out in the cold. In due time, Henry VI's grand plan came to light. He wanted to marry Margaret to his half-brother Edmund in order to keep her ostensible claim to the throne within the family. Margaret had barely hit puberty, but the king and Edmund didn't care. The marriage took place on November 1st, 1455. Men close to Margaret, like her father, John, and her custodian, the Duke of Suffolk, seemed to meet tragic, sudden fates. Her husband was no different. It was the early stages of the Wars of the Roses, and Edmund was fighting in Wales. The Yorkists captured and imprisoned him. Then, while in captivity, he succumbed to the plague. He and Margaret had been together for all of 6 months. Margaret was now a widow at 13 and 6 months pregnant. She would give birth to a boy named Henry Tudor. Margaret had lost nearly every person who was supposed to protect her, and she had little agency. From the time she was a toddler, people had been pulling her in different directions. She was determined to stop the same thing from happening to her son. This was the moment when Margaret Beaufort went from pawn to ruthless matriarch. After her husband died, his brother Jasper had stepped in to protect her. Even during the Wars of the Roses, when family members and old friends frequently turned on each other, Jasper remained a champion and ally to both Margaret and her son Henry. He arranged a marriage with Sir Henry Stafford, the son of a duke and Margaret's second cousin. Margaret's son Henry was still a ward of his uncle, Jasper Tudor. That meant that he had to stay with Jasper while Margaret was headed off for life with her husband. Mother and son were separated when he was about 2, though Margaret and her husband were allowed to visit him at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where Jasper lived. All the while, things in England were getting more and more tumultuous by the day, until they reached a fever pitch. The Wars of the Roses were raging. After Henry VI and his wife fled to Scotland, the Yorkist forces won the Battle of Towton. As a result, there was a new Yorkist king in England, Edward IV. The new king stripped Margaret's son of his land and properties. On top of that, Margaret's husband Henry Stafford had fought with the Lancasters at the Battle of Towton and lost. Even though Stafford was loyal to the Lancasters, he made a dramatic sacrifice for Margaret. He sought pardon from King Edward IV, and as a result was able to purchase the wardship of her son Henry for £1,000. Stafford then sent the boy to live with the Yorkist nobleman who had taken over Jasper Tudor's earldom. Margaret's son was safe, for now. As the Wars of the Roses raged on, Edward IV and Henry VI vied for the crown. Then the Battle of Barnet broke out. It was here that Margaret's husband suffered serious injuries, from which he wouldn't recover. Margaret was once again a widow at just 28 years old. Edward IV had slain Henry VI's son at the Battle of Tewkesbury, leaving the Lancasters without a clear heir. Henry VI himself died while imprisoned in the Tower of London. Margaret's son was now the foremost Lancaster claimant to the throne, which is great unless you're going up against Edward IV. After his victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward had systematically picked off his rivals for the throne. Margaret knew what was coming, so she begged her son to flee to France. The boy sailed to Brittany, and Margaret wouldn't see him for another 12 years. Just 9 months after her husband's death, Margaret married Lord Thomas Stanley, a widower with strong ties to the House of York. While married to Henry Stafford, he'd been in the driver's seat. This time, Margaret wanted to be the one to play hardball with the power players of the English court. Henry VI was gone, and Edward IV was firmly in power. It seemed like the Wars of the Roses were done, or at the very least, at a standstill. The action wasn't happening on the battlefield anymore, it was happening in the royal court, giving Margaret a prime opportunity to participate in the political manoeuvring. Margaret charmed the king and his wife, Elizabeth Woodville. Before long, they were making her godmother to one of their children. She was exactly where she wanted to be. Edward IV then suggested that perhaps they could marry her son Henry to his daughter Elizabeth of York. But there was a sinister side to this proposal. Many believe that Edward was actually trying to get Henry to return to England in order to assassinate his rival to the throne. Margaret may have been playing nice with the king, but she was no fool. It's believed she warned her son of the king's devious plot, and as a result he was able to dodge Edward's men. The king couldn't strike back at Margaret, doing so would only expose his true intentions. So he kept trying other ways to get the boy back to England, and Margaret kept outsmarting him. But all that was about to become moot anyway. In 1483, Edward IV died after a short illness. Soon after, his brother Richard locked the king's 2 sons in the Tower of London, claiming that it was in preparation for the eldest's coronation. The boys were never seen again. Edward's brother claimed that the king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, making their children illegitimate, and then took the throne, crowning himself King Richard III. They say to keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and that's exactly what Margaret Beaufort did. Despite her allegiance to Elizabeth Woodville, Margaret and her husband attended the coronation of Richard III, where she carried his wife Anne Neville's train. She may have been playing nice, but underneath the surface, she was already planning her next move. She was in regular contact with Elizabeth Woodville and proposed an alliance that would solidify her son's claim to the throne. Margaret suggested that her son wed Edward and Elizabeth's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Margaret had also found an unexpected ally in an unlikely place. His name was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and if that sounds familiar, it's because he was Margaret's second husband's nephew and namesake. While Buckingham had initially backed Richard III, he became increasingly disenchanted with the new king, which was something Margaret sought to exploit. Margaret and her son Henry offered to back Buckingham if he'd gather men to rebel against Richard III, and soon enough, he took her up on this offer. Margaret's son Henry Tudor, still exiled in Brittany, had a massive team of supporters there. The plan was for them to join with a number of regional forces in England and march on London. However, a rebellion in Kent broke out early, alerting Richard III to the fact that the Duke of Buckingham had turned against him. The Duke was convicted of treason and executed. One of Margaret's best allies was gone. Unfortunately, the king was now aware of her intentions and had to punish her too. He stripped Margaret of her titles and estates and accused her of high treason. However, the punishment didn't exactly match the gravity of her transgressions. He simply transferred her property fully to her husband, Lord Stanley, and imprisoned her in Stanley's home. Soon enough, she would come to make him regret showing mercy. Margaret continued to contact her son in secret, and both worked tirelessly to gather forces to support him. Margaret knew that she'd gotten off easy after the last rebellion, and that she might not have the same luck were she to fail again. Their next attempt would be their final chance to capture the throne. Thus far, Margaret's plotting had taken place in the royal court. Now it was time for her son to take it to the battlefield. Henry Tudor made it to English shores and began a slow advance toward Richard's forces, picking up more supporters as he went. They finally met near Ambion Hill in Leicestershire, where Richard was waiting. Richard then took Margaret's stepson hostage and threatened to execute him. Lord Stanley coldly told the king, "Sire, I have other sons." Richard tried to get his troops to behead Stanley's son, but they refused, saying that battle was imminent. The Wars of the Roses culminated in the Battle of Bosworth Field, which was brutal, bloody, and decisive. Margaret, still a prisoner at her husband's home, prayed and waited for news. Her son Henry had little to no experience in battle. Richard came within sword's length of Henry, who smartly retreated, only for William Stanley, Margaret's brother-in-law, to come through with his forces and take down the king. In the end, although Henry Tudor did have a familial claim to it, it was the right of conquest that won him the crown, and he became King Henry VII. Henry then married Elizabeth of York and gave Margaret the responsibility of overseeing their children's household, and even named his eldest daughter for her. The great hope for the future of the Tudor name lay in the king's eldest son, Arthur, who the entire family doted on. From the time Arthur was basically an infant, Margaret Beaufort dutifully planned for his future wedding. Sensing that an alliance with Spain would put them in a good position, she convinced the King of Aragon to wed his daughter Catherine to her grandson. Shortly after his marriage, Arthur and his wife Catherine began to ail with a mysterious sickness. While Catherine made it, Arthur did not. The loss devastated Margaret and the rest of the family, and it also put the Tudor dynasty in jeopardy. Immediately, Margaret recovered the only way she knew how, by going into overdrive planning what would happen next for her grandson Henry, the new heir apparent. Elizabeth of York gave birth to a daughter in 1503, but succumbed to a postpartum infection soon after. The loss devastated Henry VII and sent Margaret into a tailspin. In 1509, Henry contracted tuberculosis and died soon afterward. Henry had been Margaret's reason for being since she'd been a teenager, and now she'd outlived him. While she planned his funeral, she simultaneously organised the coronation of her grandson Henry, who would become King Henry VIII, and his wedding to Catherine of Aragon. Margaret Beaufort had remained loyal to the deposed Elizabeth Woodville, and perhaps even tried to help free her sons and heirs to Edward IV, the princes in the Tower. However, one historian has advanced a more disturbing possibility. She claims that getting rid of the two boys would have helped clear Henry Tudor's path to the throne. Thus, when one looks at who could have possibly had the motive to trap the heirs in the Tower, she pointed at Margaret Beaufort as potentially being the one behind their captivity, or, conceivably, having been the one to give the order to have the brothers murdered. Margaret died just 2 months after her beloved son, at the age of 66. It also happened to be just 5 days after the coronation of Henry VIII, and 1 day after his 18th birthday, almost as if she were waiting for the last Tudor male to be a majority-age king in his own right, before she retired forever. Margaret Beaufort did not leave loose ends. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.